In this section of the lecture, I'm going to talk about a second main theme which characterised this period of economic development after World War II. This is the rise of the role of government in the economy, in particular the rise of the welfare state. The origins of the welfare state are often dated back to the late 19th century in Germany, with moves to provide social protection, to provide assistance to people who were sick or who had had accidents or in old age. And that was codified in the German National Insurance Code in the early 20th century. After Germany had made that move, other countries in Europe moved relatively quickly to progressively introduce similar legislation. The German legislation is associated with Otto Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany. And I've included a quote here from Biography of Bismarck by Jonathan Steinberg. It's a quote that comes from a government gazette, and it's talking about the Reichstag having accepted the legislation to introduce government assistance relating to sickness and accident and old age. And it's making the point that this was really a revolutionary shift from the way in which previously it had been viewed that people should deal with circumstances like sickness and accident. So the Gazette said, by acceptance of the principle of compulsory state insurance, an end has been put to all those attempts to make health insurance a private matter for those affected, and formally and publicly asserts the role of the state in the provision of care for workers who have become ill in the course of employment. In the next slide, I've sort of shown a time series of the number of countries in Europe adopting different types of social security legislation. So you can see the blue is accident, the pinky is sickness, and the red is old age. And so that's what Germany sort of introduced. And you can see that sort of it took until the start of the 20th century, but basically, by the 1920s, a lot of countries in Europe have adopted those types of social security insurance. Later on, you also get legislation relating to assistance for unemployment being developed, and then also later still family allowance, or legislation relating to family allowance assistance. Now, at the time that Germany was originating these types of welfare policies, and other European countries were introducing them, there was a major debate over the appropriate model of social policy. And there were really sort of two models in that debate. One, which is the second approach I've got listed there, is what you might call group-based social insurance. Group-based social insurance was the idea that any government role in assisting people should be restricted to insurance type schemes, that is where people sort of paid in and then got some amount of money out if they were if a particular condition affected them, and also group-based. So group-based was the idea that you identified particular groups, like say workers and that, who you wanted to assist in particular circumstances, like if they became ill. The other model was what we'd call a universal social welfare assistance model, and that's where you're thinking more in terms of the government providing assistance without of, say, general tax revenue, without people having to have directly made contributions, and also the scheme's more universal. So you've got a much more broader approach to who can receive assistance if a particular condition, such as sickness or accident, affects them. Now, in the next slide, I'll show some data on the expenditure on social protection by government. And that slide will show that initially out of these two models, it was the second model that governments adopted. So even though they were legislating to introduce assistance to people, it was relatively restricted in terms of the government commitment via its own expenditure of tax funds to providing welfare assistance. It's really only after World War II that the first model of universal assistance comes to the fore, and at that time expenditure starts to increase. And that's captured in this quote by Paul Johnson in his review article about welfare states in Europe, when he says post-war welfare has been increasingly incorporationist. So by that he means increasingly moving towards universal rather than being group-based, and it's also been increasingly expansive, by which he means covering a wider range of circumstances which might adversely affect people's well-being. So in the post-war period, the welfare system becomes increasingly extensive, and that means greater expenditure by government on this area. In the late 20th century, there come to be some concerns about the welfare system, about its incentive effects, that by providing welfare, the government is reducing the incentive for individuals to engage in economic activity. For example, if you provide unemployment benefits, that gives an incentive for people to remain unemployed longer rather than job search, for example. And also a concern about the fiscal viability of welfare systems. So for example, with ageing populations and with governments committed to making payments to older people, whether that means you're going to run into problems in terms of being able to actually finance out of tax revenue the payments which you have in the past been making to people who are older. The next slide, as I said, just makes the point about the growth of expenditure after World War II. So even though during this period, say before 1930, we've got all these countries in Europe introducing legislation about social welfare, it's really restricted in terms of the extent to which government has a financial commitment because of that. And that's because it tends to be more narrowly group-based, and it tends to be insurance-based. Whereas after World War II, we get large increases sort of in the amount of government spending on GDP. On average in Europe, sort of by 1990, we've got in Europe about 25% of GDP being spent on social transfers. Within Europe, you've got variability, where in Sweden that's over 30%. In the UK, it's around about between 15 and 20%. If we compare to the US is a bit less. If we think about this then, there's sort of two questions. One is, why would we have gone sort of from this world to this world where there's a big increase in the amount government spending on social transfer, and what might explain why different countries are spending different amounts of money? And so that's something that I will address now as the final part of this section of the lecture. So if we think about sort of just what you might call the maths of this, then the maths of it are that the reason governments ended up spending more on social welfare is that there were more types of expenditure, and the coverage of expenditure was broadened. They also increased the level of benefits that they were providing to people associated with, say, conditions like unemployment. And there was also a demographic effect, which I've already referred to. The idea that with population ageing, if you've got benefits which are targeted at old people, then you're going to need to be spending more to be paying those benefits. So there's a demographic factor that's underpinning the growth in welfare spending in the period after World War II. If we think about sort of what are the explanations that underlie that maths, there's several main features here. One of them is the role of political voice. So in the 20th century, this was a period when in particular lower income groups, working class, have increasingly been enfranchised in political systems. They've had an increased voice to affect policy making. And so, not surprisingly, policy making has started to reflect more the interests of this group, who, for example, are more likely to become unemployed, more likely to experience sort of variability in their income, where the troughs in their income really seriously adversely affect their well-being. So the increased voice of people who are less well off is one explanation for why there's more attention to and spending on welfare policy by governments. The type of political system matters here, in that we know that political systems with greater degree of proportional representation, because they allow a greater voice to subgroups within the population, are more likely to be associated with growth in welfare expenditure. Second factor is income growth. So the fact that during the period after World War II, countries in Europe became better off, that's a factor that meant that they could more afford to spend on welfare policy, to try and underpin the well-being of people who are less well off in society. It doesn't seem, though, that differences in the amount of spending are related to income inequality, that countries that spend more were countries that had more inequality and market income inequality, and so they were trying to redress that through the welfare state. But income growth does seem a fact that explains why there was this increase in spending. A third factor is that this was a period in Europe where there was considerable structural change going on and opening up to the world economy, both of which cause larger adjustment costs in the economy. And so one rationale for the welfare state is that it can be seen as government providing a safety net which made people in society willing to accept the amount of structural change and the globalisation that were going on. That because they knew that if, for example, they became unemployed, they'd be able to get unemployment benefits, it made them accepting of the structural change that was going on in the economy. And government, in that way, were buying support for having this structural change in the economy to allow economic development. There are also various social influences such as racial fractionalisation and the role of the church, which we think affects the extent to which different countries adopted or were willing to spend on welfare policy in the period after World War II. The big consequence of this episode seems to have been increasing income equality, that in most places where the welfare state, where welfare expenditure increased, that was targeted relatively effectively at people at the lower end of the income distribution, and so it had the effect of compressing the income distribution after you take account of government taxes and transfers. In the last section of this lecture, I'll talk about the final main theme, which is to do with the growth of female labour force participation.